Rondas.
Beste luisteraar, vandaag praat ik met de New Yorkse socioloog Craig Calhoun over nationalisme. Nee, schrikt u maar niet, het zal niet gaan over nationalisme als de moeder van alle kwaad. We zullen eerder proberen een antwoord te formuleren op de vraag waarom naties er nog altijd toe doen. Nations Matter, want dat is ook de titel van zijn boek, uitgegeven bij Routledge. Op de Amerikaanse politieke schaal is Calhoun een liberal. Dat wil zeggen in Europese termen bijna een sociaal of christendemocraat. En als ik het goed heb, staat hij daar zelfs een beetje links van. Want daar staan trouwens de meeste sociologen in de wereld. Hij is voorzitter van de zeer invloedrijke Social Science Research Council en hoogleraar aan de New York University. En hij is de derde New Yorker in een reeks van 4 die deze maand in dit programma hun licht over de wereld laten schijnen. Na Dirk-Jan Epping en Tony Judd en voor Nobelprijswinnaar Joseph Stiglitz volgende week. En dat hij, Calhoun, zijn licht laat schijnen op het fenomeen van het nationalisme, dat is niet zo uitzonderlijk voor een Amerikaans academicus. Velen doen dat als historicus of als socioloog of antropoloog. Maar dat hij als linksacademicus het nationalisme gewoon verdedigt, dat is wel uitzonderlijk. En dan nog in een goed geschreven reeks essays en in een kloeke argumentatie waarin hij de realiteit van cultuur en geschiedenis plaatst tegenover The Cosmopolitan Dream. Dat is zijn ondertitel. The Cosmopolitan Dream, die slechts een droom is. Hij begint met de stamboom van het woord en van het concept natie, alreeds in de Hebreeuwse Bijbel en bij de Romeinen. In de Bijbel, het Oude Testament, zijn de naties altijd gelijk aan de volkeren en die volkeren zijn altijd heidens. Denk aan Hendels Messiah, waarin de psalmist uit psalm nummer 2 zich in een woede-aria afvraagt waarom de naties zo woedend woeden. Why do the nations so furiously rage together and why do the people imagine a vain thing, door samen te spannen against the Lord and his anointed. En na 25 eeuwen sinds die tekst zijn de volkeren er nog altijd en de naties ook. En wordt er nog altijd naar een invulling gezocht die recht doet aan die eigenaardige dialectiek van continuïteit en verandering die daarin vervat zit. En Craig Calhoun doet mee in die zoektocht. Door straks te verwijzen naar een zekere Johannes Althusius, dus, verwijst hij naar de confederalistische ideeën van deze vernederlandste Duitser in de tijd van de Nederlandse opstand tegen Spanje 1580-1600 in Emden. Ook toen deden de theoretici van die opstand een beroep op de soevereiniteit van het volk. En vandaar naar We the People van 1789 of Wir sind das Volk van 1989 loopt inderdaad een rode draad. En die draad is geweven uit een pre-politiek solidariteitsbesef en een cultureel gemeenschapsbewustzijn. En daarom verzet Calhoun zich met klem tegen de opvatting dat nationalisme gewoon een vergissing zou zijn. Fout, verkeerd. Vanaf nu kunt u naar hem luisteren.
Yet our modern notion of people and the notion of nation undergoes some change. So when we say it's an ancient concept, we don't mean there's been no change. And the change is shaped largely by the rise of the modern state, which is a different kind of state, and which has a different kind of relationship to its people. And the idea of the people who are the legitimate subjects of a modern state, and a shift in the notion of legitimacy, in which the legitimacy of a government is defined by the consent of the people, becomes important. And that places a big stress on who the people are.
Right. We are the people.
Exactly.
Wir sind das Volk.
We the people, as it would appear in the first line of the United States Constitution, we enact this, we determine. So there's an ascending notion of legitimacy. Now that has older roots. Already we saw with people like Althusius or something an idea of das Volk as the source of legitimacy. But this becomes very basic from especially the 17th century on in Europe. And the reorganization of European politics in terms of modern nation states, rather than many small dispersed principalities, more unified states, with a material basis in roads and commerce that unites people in a society, with demotic languages dominant, so that there are states that are not...
No more Latin.
No more Latin, precisely. That people are speaking the ordinary languages, whether they're Dutch or English or whatever. And the creation of clear borders rather than vague frontiers begins to produce a new notion of nation here. And it carries forward some of that older meaning.
Right. It is in it, because even if the pre-political nation does not exist in a way that we say exists, even then Italians knew very well where Italy was.
And they still do today. And we still behave in part on the basis of an idea that there is a kind of pre-political solidarity. For most of us, most of the time, we're vague about this. We don't know exactly where it comes from. But we don't believe that we are together only because of our politics. We believe that we have our common politics partly because we are together.
There the notion of culture creeps in.
Yes, and part of what is misleading about some sort of concepts of moving past the nation state, giving up the nation state, is the notion that you could have individuals without culture. Where is such a human being? There is no human being who doesn't have culture.
And if there was a human being who pretends that, this would be his culture.
Exactly right. As I've argued about some people who claim to be global cosmopolitans and claim to escape from culture. In fact, they live in a culture of people who meet each other in first-class lounges on airports, are familiar with the culture of wine and the reading of the Financial Times and the Economist magazine, and whether it's better to go to Sciences Po or to the Kennedy School at Harvard. And that's a culture.
And it's exactly those transnationalists and proponents of the indeed very attractive visions of cosmopolitanism. We are all humans. We have all the same holes in our body. You know, it's exactly those people who kind of denigrate every brand of nationalism as backward, outmoded, tasteless, as you write, ill-educated.
That's right.
It's an error.
We tend to behave as though nationalism is both a moral and an intellectual error, instead of to ask what makes a particular form of national identity better or worse.
Why do they pretend it's an error?
Well, there are various reasons. One of them is that the idea of nation has been very much tied up with the idea of the inheritance from pre-modern times. And so the ideology of being modern suggests we must be moving forward. A second reason is that nationalism has been associated very much with some of its evils and excesses, with ethnic cleansing, or before that with National Socialism, and the idea that nationalism is known through these terrible versions is very widespread. And the idea then is that we must avoid that, and we avoid that by being constitutional patriots, by being civic, by being internationalists. But we should ask, even the word internationalist, of course, implies the nations that we are
Implies
opposing.
domestic and foreign affairs.
Precisely. And we should then, I think, recognize that it is an illusion to imagine we could move simply to a world in which there are only human beings and no divisions among them. That this is an illusion that is most available to very privileged people. And if we try to do that, it may be leaving very little way for people who don't have so much privilege to locate themselves in the world, to organize their collective projects for trying to achieve better economic development, greater democracy, or other kinds of collective goods, which they achieve largely through their national states and through trying to improve the kind of lives and institutions they have together in nations.
Maar voor de postnationalisten en de transnationalisten is nationalisme niet alleen een vergissing, nationalisme is voor hen ook moreel laakbaar. En juist tegen dit verwijt heeft de Amerikaanse socioloog Craig Calhoun, die u hier hoort, zijn boek geschreven. Nations Matter. En hij zet daar een begrippenpaar tegenover dat heel handig is om verder over nationalisme na te denken op een serieuzere manier. Dat van connections tegenover equivalence. Wat zullen we voor elkaar sociaal betekenen, wij allemaal onderling ondereen? Zijn wij als mensenbroeders gerelateerd? Zijn we verbonden? Of zijn we daarentegen inwisselbaar? Uitwisselbare en inwisselbare human resources bijvoorbeeld. En als we niet inwisselbaar of equivalent zijn, dan blijkt plots het belang van een soort vooruitkijkende geschiedenisopvatting. Geschiedenis wordt ineens belangrijk. De geschiedenis namelijk van de investeringen die de mensen in hun gemeenschappen hebben gedaan.
Well, the notion of moral illegitimacy is rooted in a kind of idea that nations amount to fairness, to a sort of prejudice for one's own, so that there should be a perfect equity and an equality of distribution.
One shouldn't prefer
And
one's own
one
culture.
should not be prejudiced. Just as if you are running for, you become a public official, you should not give favoritism to your wife or your brother. So the suggestion is you should not be favoring your fellow nation. But I think that that's a one-sided view. Of course, I am also against nepotism and favoring one's
Or
brother.
against mafia.
Or against mafia. But that doesn't mean that we should be against all solidarity or against culture, because we need it. We need, for example, family, in which parents care for children, and close connections. We need to accept that community can be arbitrary. There's no perfect universal logic that says exactly why you have these neighbors. But nonetheless, you have
They
a
are
kind
there.
of obligation to your neighbors. They are there, and you should not ignore them.
One of your arguments is that the nationalist imagery also belongs even to the most enlightened liberal concept makers,
Yes.
but they do it surreptitiously.
Well, exactly. I mean, first off, I suggest that nationalism is a kind of social imaginary. It's a way of making real these units called nations, which, after all, don't exist in a simple physical sense, but have their existence because we understand the world in this way. We have an image of the maps of the globe in our mind, with the pink and the blue spaces and all of the locations of territory. We have an image of our own country in our mind.
Historically grown, not matured, as you write somewhere, but
That's right.
historically grown.
And created, so that this is not simply a teleological development in which the seed of the nation was there from the beginning and it had to develop a certain way. There's an actual history and human investment in creating these nations. People have worked hard, and that investment is not only of kings and generals winning battles, but of ordinary people struggling to gain some laws that protect them, that enable them to participate. So the struggle for democracy helps to make the nation in that sense. So the investment that people have in the nation is real. And if we begin to say it's simply an error or something that is illegitimate because not everyone shares it, we put at risk some of the investment that people have in what they have won, the welfare systems, the minimum wage standards, the capacity to share in public education or public health institutions that are very important achievements that have been built on a national level. So I would suggest we need to think about ways to improve this system of nations and sometimes also build global institutions. So
Which we do.
I'm not suggesting that we want only to have separate nations, but that we shouldn't imagine being able to leap beyond them into a world of pure abstract individuals who simply have human rights and no national citizenship.
Because this is far beyond the real world and seems slowly only to belong to academic thought.
Yes, it's what Hegel once criticized, referring to Kant as the tyranny of the pure ought. Is something that is in principle good and that is put forward. And so it is good that we should respect human rights.
In the sense of ought to,
Yes.
should, sollen.
Right,
Sollen.
exactly. The fact that that would be good doesn't mean that we should abandon all other senses of the good. Cosmopolitanism is good, but it is not the good. And the good is defined also by social solidarity, by our capacity to connect to other people. So it's not just what makes us equivalent to all humans, but what makes us connected to some other humans more than that. That is important.
Who may differ from us, because the difference is included in the idea of the nation. Most people yet still today pretend in the nationalism studies that the difference is excluded by nations.
It's also the case that nations provide the larger encompassing units in which we come together across lines of difference. So there is always difference, and it is in fact the capacity that nations give us to have connections and discourse across these lines of difference.
Yeah.
And so it's not that there is no homogenizing, universalizing side. Nations do universalize, but they also embrace difference. And we need to see both at work. The kind of discourse of the modern nation state is misrepresented if we think it is one or the other, only sameness or only difference. Obviously, it is about connecting and joining these two sides to each other.
En zelfs de verschillen kan het nationalisme dus aan, en dat is ook nodig, want de concurrentie, die de globalisering toch is, beweert zelf de enige te zijn die de differenties ook differenties laat zijn. Calhoun stelt het nationalisme voor als een bescherming op vaste grond te midden van het drijfzand der globalisering, waarin de mensen langzaam wegzakken. Juist in dit kader gebruikt hij enkele formules. Ten eerste, je kan het nationalisme niet zomaar wegwensen. Ten tweede, naties verdwijnen sowieso niet. En ten derde, als het er niet was, zouden we het nationalisme zelfs missen, te midden van de neoliberale praktijken van pure kapitaalsaccumulatie.
We need nations because of globalization. It's an illusion to think that globalization replaces nation. Globalization makes us need nations to try to manage living in a global world.
You're one of the very few to say so.
Well, I think it's true, and it's been true for quite some time, in earlier eras of globalization as well as later, but very much today. If you imagined no nations, you would imagine most people losing their chance to have a democratic voice in how their lives would be organized in a global society. They would be more vulnerable to global pressures, to global capitalism, to external threats.
That's why nations and nationalism is not to be wished away.
Exactly. It is not to be wished away. It can be improved. It's not just to be accepted the way that we inherit it from our grandparents, but it's not to be wished away. We can build on it. We can build better things. We can have alliances among nations. I'm not suggesting we wish only to have parochialism.
By the way, nations are not vanishing.
Nations are definitely not vanishing. As I suggest, nations are becoming more important in the global context. Look at China today, and look at the intense nationalism of China. If you read only the theories of nationalism, which many academics put forward over the last 20 years, you would think that nationalism was somehow going to fade into the past because we were all becoming too sophisticated for it. You would miss Chinese nationalism, Indian nationalism,
Tibetan nationalism.
Tibetan nationalism, exactly, Brazilian. You would miss a variety of ways in which actors on the world stage are still nations.
If it was gone, we should miss it.
We would miss it very much, and we would miss it at several levels. We would miss it at the United Nations. We would miss it, though, individually within our own political and collective lives in terms of our country.
Because what the transnationalists never mention is the way how solidarity would be organized if there was not such a thing as a nation.
Most of the cosmopolitan transnational discussion is organized as though nations limit us and we need to escape from nations. And if you have a lot of money and you have a passport that makes it easy for you to travel, you may move very freely in the world. But for most people, nations are very important. They are a source of crucial services, education, healthcare, all of the kinds of things we depend on to make our lives work. And we may wish them to get better. We can all imagine a better healthcare system in every nation in the world. On the other hand, the kind of neoliberal model that suggests we should tear down all of these national systems in favor of simply a global market would not help most people in the world.
This means that neoliberalism, economic neoliberalism, runs parallel with the ideas of multicultural, transnational, cosmopolitanism, etc.
Yes, parallel is exactly the word. These run along together. They're not the same thing. so that it's quite possible to be cosmopolitan and against neoliberalism. But we should recognize the kind of complicity of a cosmopolitanism that says we should reduce the power of states, we should abandon borders, at the same time that neoliberalism is doing this in the name of capital and capital accumulation. And we should be cautious about arguing against nation states from the position of people who are privileged by their location in the neoliberal global order.
Craig Calhoun wijst er ook op hoe de grootste nationalismebestrijders eigenlijk stilzwijgend uitgaan van het bestaan van naties. Ten eerste de postnationale politieke filosofen die heel onkritisch het onderscheid blijven maken tussen binnenlandse en buitenlandse zaken en tussen nationale en internationale zaken. 2. Historici die nationale geschiedenissen blijven schrijven, ook als ze zich in het postnationale paradigma inschrijven. 3. Sociologen wier impliciete opvatting over wat een maatschappij of een gemeenschap is, eigenlijk teruggaat of gebaseerd is op de idee van de natie. Naties worden met alle zonde beladen, we hoorden het al, en vooral met oorlogen. Maar eerlijk gezegd, een imperialistische lectuur van bijvoorbeeld de 2 wereldoorlogen levert veel meer inzicht op. Niet naties, maar imperia hebben elkaar de oorlog verklaard en die oorlog aan naties aangedaan. Calhoun is zelf met deze complexiteit geconfronteerd geworden tijdens de val van de Berlijnse muur in 1989, tijdens de onderdrukking waarvan het Tiananmenplein dan het symbool is geworden in China en ten derde tijdens de poging, de mislukte poging eigenlijk, om in Bosnië-Herzegovina een multiculturele staat te stichten. Maar we beginnen met het nationalisme als modern verschijnsel. Het nationalisme is een modernisme.
They are very much interlocked, although the evaluations can change. So in what we call the early modern period of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the building of nation states was in fact part of the modern agenda, and in many ways the nation was experienced as overcoming local difference in a more universal pattern, so that it was creating a universal
Railways.
society. Railways, indeed. And on into 1848 and the springtime of peoples, and there was an optimistic sense that this was the way forward. In the 20th century, people became much more chastened by the idea of nation after the 2 world wars in Europe, for example.
Understandable.
Understandable, and there clearly are these potential bad sides to nationalism.
But were it the nations that provoked those wars? Or were it, for instance, empires?
Well, it's imperialism, and we should recognize that the European nations that identified themselves as nations were also imperial powers, competing with each other globally in a way that was not simply nationalist but imperial, and often repressing the nationalist aspirations of others. The revolutionary French National Assembly, after all, in the 1790s crushed the nationalist rebellion in Haiti, which aspired only to be free in the way that French people were free. And France, the classic republic, was an empire. Most of the time it was a republic. So the history is more complicated in this way. It always has 2 sides. But at the same time, there is no guarantee in abandoning the nation that there will be any comparable power for ordinary people to have political influence. Even we can look at European Union and suggest the famous democratic deficit. There are many virtues to European unification, but increasing democracy so far has not been one of them.
Absolutely, and this you can see in the referenda, or in the not holding referenda anymore.
Well, exactly. And the famous referenda on the Constitution, of course, reveal not just questions about Europe in certain countries,
About identity.
but about identity and about the Constitution. Whose Constitution was this? This extremely long document written by a number of elites, mostly lawyers, which would, after all, have empowered lawyers a great deal. But would it have empowered ordinary people a great deal to have this common Constitution in Europe? It's not at all clear.
Yeah. When did this idea strike you first as a sociologist?
Oh, I'm not sure I can answer the very first moment. The way in which I began to work on nationalism was in the wake of 1989 and the transformations that were happening with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the changes in the former Soviet Union. And I had been working before in China, so also in communism there. I had been struck in China in 1989, where I witnessed the Tiananmen Square protests and was part of that movement, that the pursuit of democracy was very much tied up with the notion of national strengthening. That Chinese students who said, we want democracy, meant that they thought this would make China stronger than the rule of the old men in charge of the Communist Party. And so they were nationalists and democrats at once. And as I thought about it, of course, that had been true in Europe. The building of the modern European democracies was a building of national democracies by citizens demanding their national rights. And in the context of the crisis of the Eastern Bloc and the former Soviet Union, the range of different national struggles, it seems to me, were widely condemned as simply matters of lifting the lid on a pressure cooker so that old ethnic resentments came out and old battles. And that I thought was too simple, because there was a much more complex set of relationships in which nationalism was present on both sides. So you could point at, in, say, former Yugoslavia, the ethnic nationalism of Serbs, but you could point at also the ethnic nationalism of Slovenes, who were rather more politely seceding and trying to form a European state, but still nationalist. But you could also remember that there had been a Yugoslav nationalism. There had been an actual attempt to create a functioning Yugoslavia.
State-nation nationalism.
Precisely, a state-centered
Which
nationalism.
is still different from the Slovenian nationalism.
And in Bosnia-Herzegovina, before it was destroyed by war, there was, in fact, a multicultural nationalism that was being created that tried to make a Bosnian state that would be effectively multicultural. And it was oddly not recognized by the West. The West was very quick to recognize ethnic nationalist states, but not very quick to recognize this civic nationalism.
They couldn't see it.
They didn't see
There
it.
was a blind eye for that.
And that, it seemed to me, reflected...
Did you say civic nationalism?
I did. I said a civic nationalism, which is what I think was the attempt by many in Bosnia to create a nationalism that was based on a common shared identity, but not simply a common ethnicity.
Craig Calhoun, auteur van Nations Matter, Culture, History en The Cosmopolitan Dream, uitgegeven bij Routledge. En hij maakt dus ook een onderscheid tussen enerzijds civiel of civiek en anderzijds etnisch nationalisme, alhoewel hij ook zegt en schrijft dat ethnicity een te beladen woord is voor wat de sociologen er meestal mee bedoelen. En ze bedoelen met etniciteit zoiets als een historisch gegroeide gemeenschap met een dagelijks maar vanzelfsprekend plebiscit. Hij geeft het voorbeeld van Schotland. Calhoun is trouwens een Schotse naam, super Gaelic tot en met, en Amerikaanse Calhouns met varianten in die namen, er komt soms een Q in, behoren tot de kernmigranten van de Verenigde Staten. Luistert u maar, als hij straks als Amerikaan over Schotland begint, dan gaat hij zowaar met een licht Sean Connery-accent praten. Maar hij geeft zijn Amerikaans-Schotse identiteit hier prijs om over geschiedenis te kunnen praten als factor van het nationalisme zoals hij het begrijpt, want geschiedenis wordt gemaakt, alleen essenties groeien. Gemaakte geschiedenis vervangt dan gegroeide essenties. Gemaakte geschiedenis wijst op makers en werkers, zowel in het verleden als in het heden en in de toekomst. Geef mij maar geschiedenis in plaats van essentialisme.
I think the most important part of national solidarity is actually the institutions that people share together. So it includes culture, but it also includes economic and political and welfare and educational and other institutions.
Ways of doing things,
Exactly.
economically and money-wise.
Precisely.
But is this an emotional and imaginative foundation enough for a nation?
These things happen together. You asked whether civic nationalism is enough or ethnic nationalism. My answer is that the distinction points to two sides that coexist in every nation. There is no nation that has only civic nationalism without some sense of common identity, common culture, common sentiment. But at the same time, simply having the same language or the same historical culture is not enough to hold a people together.
Right.
So that it's always a question of the combination.
Balance.
Culture has a role, but when we say culture, we may mean simply the common denominators we share, like speaking the same language, but we may also mean the participation in a common act of creativity, of creation, so that when we think of a culture, we think of something that is being made anew. We would be mistaken if we thought, for example, that British culture was simply the sum total of Scottish, Irish, Welsh, and English culture, that it didn't involve any new British culture, including British culture that is being created by people who have come from India or other former colonies and are participating in the making of this culture.
And then you see the persistence of the old ethnicities, Scotland having devolution.
You certainly see that, and you see projects of trying to reclaim them in a new way in the context of Europe, because these smaller units can take on a new kind of meaning in connections with others, whether we speak of the Basque Country or Scotland or what have you. But it's not simply the continuity. I think it would be a mistake if we imagined that what it is to be Scot today is simply a continuation without change of what it was to be a Scot 100 or 500 years ago. To be a Scot is to participate in a transformation that the great Scottish moralists Ferguson and Adam Smith changed in the 18th century, but that changed again in the 19th century by British imperialism when the Scots played such an important role in the British armies, and changed again in the 20th century and today in the context of the European Union. So when people make the Edinburgh Music Festival and they position Scotland as a kind of Edinburgh as a kind of global city, right? They are changing Scottish culture, but they are keeping it alive. If they don't change it, it dies.
But they're keeping something alive.
Yes.
What is that without being essentialist?
It is a history that is kept alive, a continuous history that has connections and offers us resources for remaking our lives together.
But
in the
there you
present.
see the importance of history,
Precisely.
something which is denied by many of those post-nationalist, transnationalist
Yes.
cosmopolitans.
Absolutely true. The post-nationalist arguments usually are constructed with a
Ahistorical.
great deal of ignorance of history, and it's sort of a contempt of history as being only for the past.
Yeah.
But of course, history is resources for the present and the future as well.
Yeah. Contempt of history, contempt of culture, because that is particularistic.
Precisely. The attempt to be only universalistic can get you off on the wrong foot. And I don't suggest that there are no universal values, but that we live always in a dialectic between the more universal and the particular, between that which is general and that which is specific to us at the individual and the collective levels, so that we cannot ignore history, we cannot ignore culture. What there is a set of relationships among people who share some things, including some arguments with each other.
And grumbling, political grumbling.
Grumbling and discontent. They sometimes share even ethnic jokes about each other, but they know the meaning of those jokes. They inhabit a common
They can
space.
share a civil war.
They can sometimes share a civil war, and sometimes they recover from it, and sometimes they don't. So there's no guarantee in having some common cultural history that everyone will live happily together in the future. But there are resources in that common cultural history for being able to communicate with each other and build something if we choose to build something together in the present. The choice is still there. And one of the things that bothers me about some of the cosmopolitan arguments is that they don't include a place where people make a choice about how they're going to live together. And I think it's very important that we think about this as a collective choice. What institutions do we want? What way of living together do we want? And that it be possible for different groups in the world, different nations, to make different choices.
How will we live together here in
Yes.
this spot of the world?
Exactly. Where we
It's a
means
locality.
this population.
Yeah.
And from my point of view, it is a better choice if we are open to immigrants and diversity, but it's a choice that people have to make collectively.
Also, those immigrants have made a choice by coming, for instance, to Quebec and accept the legislation that is there.
Yes, immigrants who come to a place take on responsibilities to become part of that place. And the people who are there, if they are accepting immigrants, take on responsibility to relate to those people, to learn something about them.
Everybody wants to live together. Why can't we live together?
Timmy Thomas laat dit dan mijn akoestische bijdrage zijn tot de jongste campagne van de Standaard met Le Soir de voorbije week, waarin deze kranten voorstellen publiceerde van jonge en halfjonge, want alreeds halfoude, goedmenende mensen om België te redden, zoals daar waren, ik varieer kort op wat ik las, 2 dagen lang de geschiedenis afschaffen, 3 dagen lang de taal of de talen die ons verdelen afschaffen. Het moet de redacties ontgaan zijn dat afschaffen van geschiedenis en van taal eigenlijk op hetzelfde neerkomt, maar zwart. Omdat die voorstellen niks voor te stellen hadden, bij gebrek aan kennis en bij gebrek aan verbeelding, waren dat voorstellen die zo kant nog wal raakten dat je ze tot de literatuur zou rekenen als ze niet zo slecht geschreven waren. Welnu, in het licht daarvan lost Timmy Thomas in 1972 toch alles op. Everybody wants to live together. Why can't we live together? Voilà, België is gered. Het is tegen dat soort klap, de Cosmopolitan Dream, dat de nuchtere links-democrat Craig Calhoun dit boek schreef. Met daarin 3 goede argumenten pro. Ten eerste, nationalisme levert empowerment op, bemachtiging. En bemachtiging veronderstelt grenzen. 2, het is slechts als burgerrechten dat mensenrechten kunnen worden afgedwongen. Hannah Arendt, wier Joodse essays, de Jewish Writings eigenlijk, in het Nederlands vertaald pas zijn uitgegeven bij Atlas. Ten derde, a sense of belonging, een gevoel van te behoren, de thuisfilosofieën, de eigenlijke inzet ook van de strijd tussen de Nederlandse SP van Marijnissen en de Nederlandse PvdA van Wouter Bos. Zij, de PvdA, maken heel dit gedachtegoed verdacht. Eerst reduceren ze de SP tot Fortuyn en dan van Fortuyn verder naar Haider, onlangs in een artikel, en natuurlijk van Haider naar Hitler. Het scheelt toch maar een beetje letters in a charade. Now, to conclude, arguments pro-nationalism. First, it gives a framework for large-scale experiments in democracy.
Yes, nationalism gives a framework for democratic decision-making, and it gives people the connections to each other to organize democratic movements and to empower themselves in relationship to the larger world.
Yeah, empowerment.
Empowerment is crucial. If it is through nations, including national governments, that people are able to find their specific adaptations that they choose to global markets and to other global conditions. It's not by simply facing the world as individuals that we are strong. It's when we join with others on the basis of connections, including proximity and common government and common language, but
And
not only
borders.
this. And borders. So,
Because you need borders, eh?
well, there's no imaginable alternative. I think if you say only borders, if you said, well, everyone should build a wall or a fence at every border, that's madness. I think if you imagine that there is an easy way to abandon borders, that's also madness. And therefore the question is how to work with reasonable justice and fairness in a world in which nations remain important.
Right. Second good argument, I think, it's only as civil rights that human rights can be saved, enforced. Hannah Arendt.
Well, Hannah Arendt famously, in the context of the crises of the middle of the 20th century, reminded us that human rights are at best a kind of last resort for people who have lost the rights of citizens, and that people are in a weak and usually terrible situation when they are stateless. And so to imagine making people stateless, to imagine removing the nation state in favor of simply universal human rights, is to disempower people, to remove much of the protection that people have from civil rights, much of the enforcement mechanism which is available to guarantee rights in the world. What we need is to keep making the structures of civil rights stronger and to make sure that they include the more general rights that we consider human rights, that those are protected in each country. But we can't do away with the still more particular and usually national structures that provide citizens with not merely an abstract ideology, but a reality of rights they can use.
Right. And Hannah Arendt had her whole history, personal history, and the history of her peoples, in the plural,
Yes.
to be induced to saying so.
Well, Hannah Arendt is a considerable inspiration for me in two senses of this. One is exactly what you say, that she had the situation of the European Jews in mind and the terrible loss they suffered when they became stateless. She had the disasters of National Socialism itself in mind and the kind of totalitarian society created by this attempt at ethnic purification, which was a domination of Germans. As she pointed out, it was not only an expulsion of Jews, it was a demand, a domination of Germans who were in a way oppressed by it as well, even if not in the same horrible way as the Jews. And she had the example of America and a society that accepted immigrants, not always easily or happily or as much as it should have, but did, and was open to change. And she drew a particular example from America that was important for thinking about nationalism, which was that there was a sense of self-creation to Americans. Because it was a new country and the Constitution was relatively recent, you could look
Founding
of America was natality. It was making something new in the world. And we need to realize that that natality is available to all of us in every nation. It is not the case that any nation was only made in ancient history and we must simply accept it the way we inherit it. It is always something that we can remake, and we can remake it in stronger and better ways.
The sense of belonging.
The sense of
That's
belonging.
a third argument,
It
pro.
is a third argument. So I think belonging is very important. It is not the only important thing. And so part of what it means to me to be mature in the world is to recognize that there are multiple and sometimes competing goods. So just as we may speak of universal human rights, we should also speak of belonging, however, and the importance for every human being of having some sense of belonging to the world through belonging to a particular community, a particular place, to having a place in the world. And human beings need this, I think, just as we never exist without language, and we inhabit language. There is no way to escape from language. There is no way to live as a human being radically and completely individualistically. We either recognize how we belong to groups, or we may misrecognize and think we are more independent than we really are. But we do belong. And with belonging comes responsibility for others, care for others, the need to take what will benefit others seriously, as well as what will benefit ourselves. And that doesn't always work perfectly. These communities into which the world is organized are very important. So a sense of belonging and a reality of belonging are both very important. If you go back to Hannah Arendt's example of the stateless Jews, it is the sense of not belonging anywhere that is so radically disempowering for the stateless person.
Het zou allemaal een zaak van links moeten zijn. Maar links zegt nu al zo lang dat traditie en identiteit en eigenheid en nationaliteit en religie niet aan rechts mogen worden overgelaten, iets te lang om nog geloofwaardig te zijn. In feite gaat het om twee manieren om je emoties te structureren, dat is een uitdrukking van Raymond Williams, of om je de wereld te verbeelden. Emoties structureren en je de wereld verbeelden. En die twee manieren zijn niet zo onschuldig, ze bestrijden elkaar. Ze zijn niet zomaar een intellectuele optie. Ze vallen soms samen met politieke keuzes in politieke conflicten, zoals nu in België, waarbij alle mogelijke mediaspin wordt ingezet. Ik heb er naar verwezen. En Calhoun noemt die twee manieren om dat te verbeelden en te structureren, de keuze, we zeiden het al, tussen connecties en equivalenties. If not belonging is such a catastrophe, then this is really a cause of the left.
It should be a cause of the left, and sometimes it is. The left has often been very emphatically concerned with social solidarity, with the social question. Sometimes the left has collapsed into a kind of liberalism which worries only about individual rights. And it seems to me this is a mistake.
And this is the case now.
This is very often the case now, and the left must recognize that solidarity, that belonging, is a question for the left. That the left needs to be concerned with the ways in which people are joined together and connected to each other.
And can't leave this question to the right.
It can't. The left has often left family and patriotism, religion, all of these kinds of belonging
treated
to the
them
right.
with contempt.
Treated them with contempt, treated them as backward, as only traditional. And that has been a disaster often.
Yeah, they should recuperate.
The left needs to recuperate all of those different kinds of belonging. It needs to recuperate, indeed, even tradition itself, but especially it needs to be sensitive to religion, to community, to family, to patriotism, and it needs to recognize that ordinary people, working people, have big investments in these different kinds of solidarities.
Yeah. One man of the left who has been a great inspiration for many of us, Raymond Williams, coined this structures of feeling. Nationalism offers structures of feeling.
Precisely right. Not only nationalism, but of course other cultures, including even working class culture, which had a structure
Absolutely.
of feeling. But nationalism provides that. And this structure of feeling is part of what it means to inhabit the world and know you belong. To be in a place where you know how to move around, where you know how to get things done, where it feels right. And that may be a very enlarged space for some people, who may be cosmopolitans who are able to travel and enjoy this on a global scale. But for many people, it is a more local sense of belonging, and we should not look down on them for this.
In one sentence, you speak about the tensions between two different ways of imagining the world. And I imagine these tensions to be across the left and right divide. And in this problem, in this problematic, we see this first and foremost.
That's right. In every ideological group, you can see some of these same splits between people who imagine the world in a kind of cosmopolitan model of the equivalence that is established everywhere, and people who imagine it in rooted ways, nations and local communities. You can imagine the division between a notion of orientation to the connections among people or to the equivalence of people. And I want to suggest the importance of thinking about connections, even though that's something that is often argued by conservatives. So the fact that Edmund Burke has said this is important doesn't mean that it's not important. The fact that many on the left refuse to take seriously the logic of connections is a sign that many of them have fallen back into a kind of liberal individualism that they might have hoped to transcend.
Right, but which they haven't.
But which they sadly haven't.
Craig Calhoun, Nations Matter, Culture, History and the Cosmopolitan Dream, 2007 bij Routledge.